soldier stands in a rented room in Rome, and he is bored. He has stood here for 6 hours. Another 6 wait behind him, sometime after sundown, when the next man in the rotation takes his place. This is the job now. Not marching, not fighting, just standing, watching an old man write. There is a chain between them. One end circles the soldier's wrist. The other end circles the wrist of a Jewish man in his 60s, a former Pharisee, a Roman citizen, a man who once hunted down people exactly like the ones he now writes to. His name is Paul, and the chain is not a metaphor. It is iron. It is real. And for 2 years, it will never come off. You would expect a man like this to write about his chains. You would expect anger, bitterness, a record of complaint. Instead, he writes about joy. This is not a story about a courtroom. This is not a story about an escape. This is not a story about a rescue. This is a story about 4 letters, written from one room by a man who never got out. But here's the question worth carrying into everything that follows. What do you do with the years that don't go the way you planned? Here's what most people miss about Paul's imprisonment. He was not hidden away in some forgotten dungeon, cut off from the world. He was held under a Roman practice called military custody. Chained, yes, but visible, accessible, and rotated through soldier after soldier from the empire's own elite guard. Every single one of them assigned for 6 hours at a time to stand close enough to hear whatever he said. And that chain, the one built to isolate him, to shut him up, is about to do the opposite. But not yet. Keep that soldier in mind. He matters more than you think. Right now, picture the room itself. Rented, modest, a place Paul is paying for out of whatever support reaches him. A pen made of reed, dipped in ink mixed with soot and gum. A scroll unrolled across his knees. His friend Timothy sits nearby, close enough to help, close enough to witness, and somewhere across the empire, 4 communities are waiting simply to find out whether Paul is even still alive. You have to understand what house arrest cost a man like this. No pulpit, no open road, no more crossing the Aegean Sea on a ship bound for the next city that needed him. Just this room, this chain, and whatever words he could still send out. So he sends out everything he has left. 4 letters, 4 churches, 1 prisoner. And one of those letters is about to put a man's life on the line before it's even finished being written. To understand how Paul ended up here, you have to go back 3 years to a riot in a temple courtyard in Jerusalem. Paul had come to worship. Instead, a mob dragged him out, convinced he was defiling the holy place by bringing a Gentile past the boundary stones. They beat him in the street. Roman soldiers pulled him out before the crowd could kill him outright. And from that moment, Paul's life became a legal chain of custody. Arrested in Jerusalem, held in Caesarea for 2 years while governors stalled, waiting for bribes that never came. And finally, when a new governor offered to send him back to Jerusalem for trial, back into the hands of the men who wanted him dead, Paul did something almost no ordinary provincial could do. He appealed to Caesar. It was his right as a Roman citizen. And it was also, though Paul couldn't have fully known it yet, the only path that would put him in a rented room in the capital of the empire, chained to soldier after soldier who had never once heard the name of Jesus. You can imagine the weight of that decision. Appeal to Caesar, and there is no undoing it. The case goes to Rome. You go to Rome. Whatever happens next happens there and nowhere else. There was no version of this plan where Paul stayed free. So he sailed, shipwrecked once off the coast of Malta, bitten by a viper while helping gather firewood on that same island. And finally, after months at sea, he arrived in a city that had never asked for him and would not remember his name for another 300 years? But he was not alone for long. Someone was already crossing the empire to find him. A young man named Epaphroditus had traveled from Philippi, nearly 800 miles by land and sea, carrying money the Philippian church had scraped together for Paul's support. It was not a safe trip. It was not a short one. And somewhere along the way, or shortly after he arrived, Epaphroditus got sick. Not a mild fever. Paul later writes that his friend was sick almost to the point of death. Picture that. A man crosses an empire to bring comfort to a prisoner, and instead nearly becomes the second body in that rented room. What would you have done in Paul's place, watching a friend nearly die for the crime of showing up for you? Paul sits with him, nurses him, watches him recover by what Paul calls, plainly, the mercy of God. And when Epaphroditus is finally well enough to travel again, Paul sends him home, carrying with him the letter to the Philippians, the most joy-filled words Paul will ever write. Hold on to that detail. It will matter more than it sounds like it should. But before that letter, there is another one. And in it, Paul does something remarkable with the very chain that was supposed to shame him. Writing to the church at Ephesus, Paul never once calls himself a victim. He calls himself something else entirely, an ambassador in chains. Stay with me on that phrase, because it matters. An ambassador speaks for someone greater than himself. An ambassador is not defined by his circumstances, but by who sent him. Paul takes the exact thing meant to strip him of dignity and turns it into a title. He is not Rome's prisoner. You could say he is Christ's ambassador, simply working from an unusual office. The chain is real, but it is not, in Paul's mind, the point. So ask yourself, if the worst thing that ever happened to you became the very platform your life is remembered for, would you recognize it in the moment or only looking back? Hold that thought, because here is where the whole picture starts to come together. One prisoner, one rented room, 4 letters: Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, and one more we haven't gotten to yet. A letter so personal, it reads almost like a private note that accidentally became scripture. 4 communities scattered across the empire, each one receiving a piece of a man they were told might never walk free again. If you're starting to see the pattern here, a prisoner who refuses to sound like one, that's exactly where this is headed. But it gets stranger before it gets clearer. Someone is about to walk into that room who has no right to be there at all. Now back to that room in Rome. His name was Onesimus, and he was running for his life. In the Roman world, a slave who fled his master wasn't just breaking a rule. He was committing a crime that could end in branding, mutilation, or death, depending on how angry the master was and how the law wanted to make an example of him. Onesimus belonged to a man named Philemon, a wealthy believer who hosted a house church back in Colossae. And somehow, in a city of over 1 million people, this runaway found his way to the one room in Rome where a chained prisoner was still, somehow, preaching. Of all the doors in Rome he could have knocked on, why that one? Here's the part nobody tells you. Paul didn't just meet Onesimus. Paul writes that Onesimus became his own child in this chain. The same word, the same tender phrase Paul uses for the people he loved most. A man who described himself as desmios, the Greek word for prisoner, one who is bound, defined by his chain. That same man became a father to a fugitive slave, born not through freedom, but inside captivity. Sit with the irony of that for a second. Paul is bound. Onesimus is running. And somehow, in that one room, the bound man is the one setting someone else free. But freedom for Onesimus meant walking straight back toward the danger he had escaped. Around this same time, Paul finished a letter to the church at Colossae, a letter meant to be carried by a trusted courier named Tychicus, walking and sailing across hundreds of miles of Roman roads and open water to deliver it. But Paul added something to the plan. He sent Onesimus with him, back to Colossae, back to the very city he had fled, back, potentially, to Philemon himself. You have to understand what that decision cost Onesimus. He wasn't just delivering a letter. He was walking back into the one place where the law said he could be killed for what he'd done. But Paul had already written a letter that would make that walk survivable. What could possibly be worth more than a man's life, written on a single page? The letter Paul sent with Onesimus is the shortest one he ever wrote, and it might be the bravest. He addressed it to Philemon, and he never once commands him to forgive Onesimus, to free him, to spare him. Paul had the authority to command it. He says so himself plainly in the opening lines. Instead, he appeals to Philemon as a friend, asking him to receive Onesimus back not as a slave, but as something else entirely, a beloved brother. Paul even offers to personally repay anything Onesimus owes, writing the promise in his own hand instead of dictating it, so there could be no question later about who had made it. Think about what Paul is asking here. He is asking a slave owner, in a culture built on the assumption that slaves were property, to look at his own runaway and see, instead, a brother, not an exception to the household, a member of it. Could you rewrite, in a single letter, how someone sees a person they've already decided they own? We don't know for certain what Philemon decided, but the letter survived. Someone in that church thought it was worth keeping, worth copying, worth passing down for 2,000 years. And tradition holds that a man named Onesimus later became a bishop in the early church. The same name, the same city, a former slave now leading the very kind of congregation that once could have condemned him. Now here is where that chain from the very beginning comes back around. Remember the soldier. Remember the 6-hour shifts, rotating through Rome's elite Praetorian Guard, each man assigned to stand close enough to hear whatever the prisoner said. Paul wasn't just being watched, he was being heard, shift after shift, week after week, for 2 straight years. The empire's own justice system did something it never intended. It delivered a captive audience of Rome's most elite soldiers straight to a man who would not stop talking about Jesus. By the time the letter to the Philippians was finished, Paul could write, with something close to amazement, that his imprisonment had become known throughout the whole imperial guard. The chain built to silence him had turned into a rotating congregation. Ask yourself what Rome actually accomplished by chaining him there, and then ask what it accidentally built instead. Nearly 2,000 years later, a German pastor named Dietrich Bonhoeffer sat in a cell at Tegel prison, arrested for resisting a regime that had turned an entire nation into a machine for cruelty. He couldn't preach from a pulpit either, so he wrote letters. And in one of them, he said that even a prison cell could become a place of unexpected fruitfulness if a person carried the right thing inside it. Bonhoeffer didn't walk out of his imprisonment alive. But like Paul, what he wrote from inside it outlived the walls that held him. This is what Paul means when he tells the Philippian church that he has learned the secret of being content in any circumstance. The Greek word is chara, joy. And it is not the joy of a man who got what he wanted. It is the joy of a man who emptied himself of what he wanted. The same word Paul uses to describe Christ himself in that very letter, kenosis, a self-emptying, and found on the other side of that emptying, something a chain could never touch. So what do you do with a story like this? Here's the first thing worth taking with you. Paul wrote 4 letters to Ephesus, to Colossae, to Philippi, and to one man named Philemon. And much of what the church still believes about unity, about joy, about reconciliation, about what it means to belong to Christ, was shaped in part by words written from inside a Roman cell. That is not a footnote in church history. That is a foundation. Here's the second thing. The chain did not stop the mission. It relocated it. Paul couldn't sail to Corinth anymore. He couldn't walk the roads to Galatia. So the mission came to him, one soldier at a time, one runaway slave at a time, one letter carried by hand across hundreds of miles at a time. This is not a story about a man who got lucky. This is not a story about a prisoner who happened to write well. This is a story about what happens when someone refuses to let a locked door become the end of the sentence. And here's the last thing, the one I want you to sit with tonight. Paul was not free when he wrote the most joy-filled letter in the entire New Testament. He was chained to a guard who didn't even choose to be there. And still, he wrote about Shara, joy, like a man who had already given away everything he was ever afraid to lose. So before you go, ask yourself the only question that actually matters here. Not which letter you like best, but what room are you sitting in right now that you've mistaken for the end of your story? Somewhere in Rome, in a museum case, behind glass no chain could ever touch, there is nothing left of that soldier. No name, no record. He is gone, the way every guard in that rotation is gone. But the old man's words are still being read tonight, in a language that didn't exist yet, on a continent no one in that room had ever heard of. The chain rusted, the room collapsed, the empire fell. The letters are still walking.